Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you. First of all, I'm Massoud Sharifi. I'm a sociologist and associate professor at University of Barcelona. I completed my PhD studies at EHESS, where I have had the privilege to know Professor Hamit Bozarslan, one of the leading scholars of history of the Middle East, of the modern Middle East. He's a professor of history and social sciences at École des Hautes Études Sciences Sociales in Paris, and his research interests include Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, Kurdish question, violence, and revolution in the Middle East. He's the author of various publications on the subject, including, for example, I have in French version, Crise, Violence et Décivilisation, in 2019, Révolution et État de violence, Moyen-Orient, 2011-2015, Histoire de la Turquie, de l'Empire à nos jours, de 2013, Une histoire de la violence au Moyen-Orient, de la fin de l'Empire ottoman à Al-Qaeda, 2008. There are some examples of his works. He is currently working on the historical and political sociology of the Middle East, as well as on the formation of new forms of anti-democracies in the world of 2000s. It's a great pleasure for us, Professor Hamit Bozarslan, to be with you. Before giving you the opportunity to speak to public, maybe I have to thank also EHESS and especially Emilia Calvo, the director of Master on Arabic and Islamic, the University of Barcelona, for providing us with such a unique opportunity. I'm not going to prolong my introduction. Maybe as you already know, Professor Bozarslan is going to talk about 40 years of war in the Middle East, and we programmed maybe 40 minutes, as you know, and after we will have the opportunity for questions. Please, Professor.
Thank you so much, dear Massoud, for this presentation, and thank you so much, EMED and its teams for organizing this event and for the invitation. I am very pleased to be here. Very pleased to be here to speak about what happens in the Middle East today, but also to see why the revolutionary contest that we had in 2011 has failed. Today, when you take what happens in the Middle East, you observe that in countries like Sudan and Algeria, there is a demand of dignity, representation, equality, and not being considered as the subject that obey to a military cartel or to a kleptocracy. In the countries like Iraq and Iran and Libya, Lebanon, you have a clear demand of not being considered as a part of a confessional sectarian organic body. And at the same time, you see a lot of violence. Violence determines the future of the Middle East. That's not the very first time that a democratic expectation or democratic demand fails. When you see what happened in Europe in the 1830s and 1840s, you see clearly that the democratic the expectations of this period they have failed, and according to Heinrich Heine, the German poet, and Karl Marx that you know, these expectations failed because they were ahead of their time. They failed because they were concurrenced by another time, the pre-revolutionary time, and this pre-revolutionary time was not at all a passive time, was not a dead time. This pre-revolutionary time could also radicalize itself and impose itself. And that's why Marx explains the 1848 revolutions led to the formation of a new, unknown kind of authoritarianism in France, Bonapartism, and elsewhere the authoritarian regimes have been reinforced. And during the 1920s and 1930s, this issue of plurality of time has been once again asked, namely but not exclusively by Marxist thinkers. Walter Benjamin, who was not a Marxist but inspired by Marxism, and particularly Ernest Bloch, when he developed his theory of the non-contemporaneity. It means that you could have in 1920s and 1930s a modern time. This modern time was determined by revolutionary expectations, democratic expectations, and at the same time, the past time, the time of the 19th century, the time of reaction was not over, and this non-contemporary time could radicalize itself and became determining in some countries like France, some countries like Italy, Germany, but also to some extent in a country like Spain. And I think that today we have something analog in the Middle East. We have on one side a massive demand of democracy, and on the other side we have the past dynamics that take the Middle Eastern societies into hostage. The Middle Eastern democratic time is today a hostage of the past times. In order to understand these past times, I will go back to 1979. And 1979, 2019, I used the concept of a 40-year war as we use the concept of the Peloponnese, the war of Peloponnese in the former in the old Greece, or as we use the concept of 30-year war in Europe between 1618 and 1648. Everybody knows that in Greece there was not one single war, but a series of conflicts. But the people could not make a sense of this conflict, so they called it the War of Peloponnese. And at the same time, in a similar way, in Europe there was not a single war that lasted 30 years, but there was a series of wars, and these wars have articulated with each other and gave to birth in the subjectivities to a single war. And we have the impression, at least I have the impression, that in the Middle East you have a similar evolution since 1979. Why 1979? Because that's the year of the end of the left-wing movements, or at least the domination of the left-wing movements in the Middle East. In the 1960s and 1970s, Middle East is scary because it is considered as a territory of the tricontinental, a territory of left-wing movements. That's the Middle East of the Fidai, the Palestinian Fidai. After 1979, this situation changes. It changes for at least 4 reasons. Because of the first reason is that you have the recognition of Israel by Egypt, and this recognition by the main resisting country in the Arab world, and which is, by the way, also the major Arab country, is considered as a betrayal of the Arab socialism. The Arab socialism until then asked the Arab populations to sacrifice a lot of things in order to create an Arab power able to resist, quote-unquote, imperialism and Zionism. But after 1979, this became simply an illusion. The Arab socialism fails. The Arab socialism fails also in Syria and in Iraq, where the military coup of 1970 and military coup of 1968 leads to the formation of massively authoritarian, violent, and sectarian regimes. But during this year also, you have another event, the occupation of Afghanistan. The occupation of Afghanistan creates a massive shock in the Muslim world, because until that moment, Soviet Union has presented itself as protector of the Muslim countries, Muslim societies, different from imperialist, colonialist countries, while the occupation of Afghanistan gives the image of a Soviet Union which is also an imperialist country, which is also a colonialist country. And this event makes that we observe the almost the death of international socialism in the Middle East. Not only the Arab socialism, but international and internationalist socialism dies out also after this event. And two spaces only, the Palestinian space, which is a transborder or supraterritorial space, and the Kurdish space, which is a transborder space, still remain as the havens of the left-wing movements, but elsewhere the left-wing movements are either very weakened or dead. And during the same year, you have two other events. The first one, an uprising in Mecca, the occupation of Kaaba by an Islamist radical Sunni group, which is to some extent a millenarist group, which creates a huge shock too, because everyone thought until that moment that the Islamists were the hangman of the American imperialism, quote unquote, in the region, while now you have clearly a radical Islamist Sunni group which became insurgent. And of course, the most important event of the year, you all know that, the Iranian Revolution, which starts as a left-wing contest in December 77, but which became a conservative right-wing revolution after the participation of the Bazari and of the Shia clergy. And this participation of the conservative elements to the revolution makes it much more radical than anyone could imagine in the region. We are not anymore in the logic of the class struggles. We are clearly in the logic of the identity conflicts, because the Middle East is interpreted as universal by itself. Islam is considered as its own horizon. The Muslims are considered as the main oppressed group in the world history. I said that in 1970s the Middle East was a part of the tricontinental. What does it mean? It means that Nasser was a figure in India or in Jakarta. It means that Leila Khaled, the Palestinian militant, entered into action in order to take the revenge of, or in order to avenge Che Guevara. So the Muslim world was not its own horizon. The Muslim world was a part of a much broader world, while after 1979, that is not the case. And after 1979, Islamism became the main dominant syntax in the region. That has a huge impact on the discourses, on the body techniques, on everything. On the discourses first, because before 1979, a young Middle Easterners would speak about the alliance of the oppressed peoples and the oppressed classes of the oppressing societies, mention the emancipation of women. After 1979, you will have jihad, the sixth obligation, the sixth pillar of Islam. You will have the idea that the world is divided into two, Darul Islam, the house of Islam, and Darul Harb, the house of war. The alterity is not seen anymore as an alterity, universal alterity, but the harb, the notion of harb, as defined on the basis of identity between 7th and 10th century became central. The techniques of core, the body. Until 1979, the Middle Eastern struggles are reincarnated by the young bodies. The body of Arafat, who is a military body, who is a dynamic body, who is not a body which cries. The body of Nasser, who takes the power when he was only 34. The body of Leila Khaled, this Palestinian militant. After 1979, you will have other bodies. The body of Khomeini, 80 years old. The body of Sayyid Qutb, executed at 60 years old in 1966 by the Nasr regime, the body of Sheikh Yassin, the Palestinian leader who is totally paralyzed, who has no physical autonomy. And these bodies will be considered as the bodies of authenticity, as the bodies of revenge, as the bodies that have not betrayed. And these bodies will ask that people enter into action, the young people sacrifice themselves in order to defend the causes they are representing. The idea of loyalty, fidelity to a cause becomes much more important than the ideal of constructing a new future. We clearly enter into a period of tragedy. In a period of tragedy, the Palestinian movement was also tragic to some extent, but it was an optimistic tragedy because the Palestinians imagined themselves as the builders of the new Middle East, while here it is important just to take the revenge of the humiliated Muslim societies. And after 1979, we observe 3 wars. And these wars actually tells us a lot on what will happen in the Middle East in the years 2010s, 2020s. The war between Iran and Iraq, which has also a sectarian dimension, which will last 8 years. The war of Afghanistan, which has started actually as a resistance against an occupying country, but which became a jihad because the Saudis and the Pakistanis transformed in a jihad with the help of the United States. And the civil war in Lebanon, which starts actually in 1975, but which will worsen considerably after 1979 and after the Israeli occupation of 82. These 3 years wars will last 10 years. And through these 3 wars, we will have a year of 1979, which becomes a decade and not only a year. Why a decade? A decade because, before everything, the figures of the violence in the Middle East changes. We will now have the Mujahid instead of the Fidai. Who is the Mujahid? The Mujahid is not the Algerian Mujahid of the 1960s. The Mujahid is the one who has sacrificed everything, abandoned his family, his richdom, his country, in order to go and fight somewhere else. The Mujahid is the Arab who goes to Afghanistan, the Turk or the Kurd who goes to Afghanistan. Afghanistan was unknown by many Middle Easterners before 1979. After 1979, Afghanistan became the reference in the Muslim world. And we will have a romanticism of Afghanistan. The first figure will be the Mujahid. The second figure will be the martyr, the Iran-Iraq war, during which hundreds of thousands of Shias from Iran, they sacrificed themselves literally in order to renew the sense of revolution. And their combat will simplify the vocabulary. Will simplify the vocabulary because before 1979, 1980, jihad was so explosive that the Muslim doctors have given a polysemic sense to it. When you die during a travel, a journey, you are considered as a shaheed. Working for a country is considered as a jihad. After 1979, this is not possible anymore. Jihad is not working on oneself. Jihad is not working for a cause. Jihad is struggle for God. And martyr is the guy who dies for the sake of God. Mujahid and martyr, and at the same time you have the militiaman, namely in Lebanon, because the war is not anymore between two armies as it is between Iran and Iraq, but in an urban context, street from street, street by street, house by house. So the old guerrilla figure, the Fidai figure, disappears, and you have the new figures of violence which emerge. But the rules of war change too. We have, first of all, a military transhumance. A military transhumance, it means that you have at least 40,000 what you call Arab Afghans, who include actually the non-Arabs too, who go and fight in Afghanistan. But they are not the only one. We have the Kurds, we have the Shia groups, we have the Sunni groups crossing the borders and waging war with or without the support of the world system, with or without support of the Westphalian states. The border, the frontiers that the British sociologist Anthony Giddens calls as the state's power containers became the places of production of massive violence. The frontiers, the borders, are not anymore Westphalian frontiers. They do not stop states, but they allow the exportations of violence of the states beyond their frontiers. And the distinction that which is absolutely central in the Westphalian logic and the Westphalian agreements, actually treaties, between the state and non-state actors disappear. Many non-state actors, they became the quasi-state, they win the quasi-state structures, and the states themselves act as non-state actors. What is the result? The result is that we have basically the main actors that will be present in the Middle East of the 2010s already during this period. Al-Qaeda is formed in Afghanistan. Take whatever leader of Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, Al-Zawahiri, Al-Zarqawi, Al-Suri, Al-Libi, Al-Misri, all of them, they have been trained in Afghanistan. Either participated or not participated to war, but they have been trained in Afghanistan. And the city of Peshawar, which was the first city that hosted them, has become a reference, a capital for the Arab world. Before 1979, the Arab world had its own capitals, either internal, Baghdad, Damascus, Tehran, or external, namely, but not exclusively, Paris and London. After 1979, Peshawar became one of the main references. A second case, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been formed in 1982 and which constitutes actually the matrix, the very pattern of the other Shia militia groups in 2010s. And the Hezbollah is a direct outcome of the 1979 events because that's thanks to the help of the Iranian pastarans, the revolutionary guards, that it is created. Or take another case, the PKK, the Kurdish organization, which is basically rebuilt, refounded in a foreign country, in Lebanon. And the first struggle of the PKK is not with the Turkish army, but with the Israeli army. The first martyrs of the PKK, they are not fallen in Turkey or in Kurdistan, but in Lebanon. And you see, through all that, how far the events of 1979 have changed the shape of the Middle East. But they have changed also after 1988, 1989. As I said, these three wars, they have lasted, the Lebanese Civil War has lasted 15 years, the other 2 years wars have lasted almost 10 years, and immediately after we thought that that was the period of war was over, but the dynamics of 1979 have remained active even after. They remained very active even after because first of all there was the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq and the Gulf War, which had a devastating effect in the Middle East, but because also the dynamics have returned back to the Arab world, the transhumance, military transhumance reinversed itself, and Egypt and Algeria have become the spaces of a guerrilla war. The Afghanistan war, the distant jihad, Egypt and Algeria have become the places. Guerrilla warfare has made some 5,000 victims, Algeria some 200,000. And the Middle East has continued its expansion. First expansion was towards Peshawar and Afghanistan. The second expansion was toward the Maghrebian countries, North African countries, namely Algeria. But particularly, the context of 1979 has determined the future with the formation and radicalization of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has emerged in 1808. It means in the wake of the Afghan War. And Al-Qaeda was able to host the margins of the Muslim societies. In the years 2000 and in the years 1990s, one has the impression that the Muslim societies have been by and large pacified, and at the same time these societies continue to produce a lot of violence, but this violence was exported towards the margins of the Muslim societies, towards the military camps in Sudan, in Somalia, or in Afghanistan, towards a student diaspora in Europe, and Al-Qaeda was able to organize these margins of the societies. Al-Qaeda was able to understand that the guerrilla warfare or the jihad in the Muslim world would not succeed. And therefore, Al-Qaeda imagined that the jihad has to be changed into a war, into an international war, that the world itself has to become the space of the war. No more borders. The borders are everywhere. Where Dar al-Harb is, it means that the house of war, and the war between the House of Islam and House of War cannot be at the frontiers. It has to be everywhere. Bin Laden was very clear about that, but al-Suri, who was, by the way, also a Spanish citizen and married to a Spanish woman, was the main man who has theorized this idea of a war within the Dar al-Harb. And Al-Qaeda has understood that the classical ways of waging violence, producing violence, was not anymore efficient. That something has to change, to change, and this change has to take place by the production of a self-sacrificial violence. Self-sacrificial violence, it means that the war has to take place on your body, in your body. Your body has to become the place of the war between the good and the evil. Your body has to be purified, and your body, after having been purified, has to be sacrificed. Your body becomes a weapon, but this weapon is also a site which has been purified. And through that, the meaning of war has to change. the meaning of the war has to change because you have to take into consideration the notion of time. For Al-Qaeda, the time of the world has become a corrupted time. You have to sacrifice this time, destroy this time, and suicidal attack is a way of destroying time because you destroy the present, but the destruction of the present means also that you destroy the past, which is corrupted, and you destroy the future, which does not promise anything. You enter from an earthly time to an eschatological time, and this eschatological time requires a violence that targets the actor of violence himself. And this kind of violence has to destroy the alterity, the otherness. The otherness, because once purified, your body has to be melted with the bodies of your enemies, or what you call the corrupted citizen of the world. Because when you destroy the others through a suicidal attack, it means that you kill the other in yourself. And after 9/11, but actually we have had a lot of signs right before 9/11, but particularly after 9/11, the suicidal attack has become the main arm of at least one part of the jihadism. So I have to go a little bit faster. I will not be able to analyze the periods of 1990s and 2000s. You all know that, and many of you have experienced that. I would say that in 2011, many observers imagined that we were at the end of this period of self-destruction, of self-sacrifice. 2011 was the moment where the Arab societies experienced or formulated a triple refusal. The refusal of the social fatigue. It means that the societies, they were extremely tired, but at one point these societies want to rebirth and became once again dynamic societies. So refusal of social fatigue, the state of tiredness, refusal of violence, because the Arab societies were on one hand, as I said, extremely pacified but producing a violence outside, and at the same time they wanted also to get rid of massively authoritarian cartel kind of regimes that were there for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and which destroyed any kind of the citizenship, any kind of hope, any kind of possibility of projecting oneself in the future. These dreams have not been fulfilled. These dreams have not been fulfilled partly because these democratic expectations have became hostage of the past dynamics. The past dynamics appear to be much more stronger than the revolutionary dynamics, as that was the case in 1848 in Europe. The past dynamics, among them, the sectarian dynamic, as we saw it in a case like in Syria. And this sectarian dynamics is also linked to 1980s, 1990s. When you take the letter of al-Zarqawi to bin Laden, the letter of allegiance of 2004, in this letter, al-Zarqawi explains that the Kurds have betrayed the promises of God, that the Kurds have become the sons of Shaitan, the Satan, that the Kurds are not anymore Muslims. But he adds immediately, never mind, our problem is not with the Kurds, but the heretics and the heresy have to be destroyed massively. Who are the heretics and the heresy is that's of course sense to Shiism. And we see that what happens in a country like in Syria, but also to some extent like in Yemen, we are clearly in this sectarian dynamic which did not dominate 1950s and 1960s, but massively dominated the period post-79. So the sectarian dynamic, the auto-sacrificial, the suicide dynamic, and just take the case of Iraq between 2003 2010, there were at least 1,000 suicidal attacks in Iraq alone. And when you take the years 2010, the suicidal attack, which changes a lot because it is not only a weapon, it is not only an arm, it has an eschatological deepness and eschatological meaning. This suicidal attack violence still continues to dominate. The military transhumance is absolutely central. As I said, it has emerged in the post-1979 period, but in the years 2010, my estimation is that there were at least 200,000 jihadis that moved from one country to another, and these moves concerned also massively Europe, while that was not the case, at least in the 1980s. The disappearance of the frontiers, the fact that the frontiers, they have become the places of continuity of states' internal violence. It means the end of the Westphalian state, which started in 1980s, but which is amplified, considerably amplified in the 2010s. The end of the distinction between the state and non-state actors. Today, you have all the states in the Middle East, or almost, which earned a paramilitary status, while the non-state actors like the Islamic State, which is not ended, which can rebirth from its ashes, the Islamic State has been able to control 300,000 kilometers. 300,000 kilometers is a territory wider than the Great Britain. And I think that this evolution explains why in some parts of the Middle East we have the reinforcement of the authoritarian regimes, like in Egypt, or the total destruction of the societies, like in Syria. Just to take a case and give some figures concerning Syria, whose conflict has changed meaning and sense almost every year, twice a year. Syria is a society of 22 million of people, 500,000 people killed, 7 million of people exiled, 6 million internally displaced. If the Syrian conflict had to take place in a country like France, that would mean 3 million of deaths and 34 million of refugees or displaced people. You are facing an enormous tragedy, and this tragedy may not be limited to Syria. One can say the same thing concerning, for instance, the Arab Sunni society in Iraq. 5 million people almost vanished totally. So I think that these dynamics of 1980s, they have been there, and that's why we can speak about a war, a 40-year war. But I think that what has worsened in the last decade, and I will stop with that, is the emergence of three hegemonic powers in the Middle East: Iran, Russia, and Turkey. And these countries have mobilized also their own time, which is by and large an imaginary time, a time of empire, a time of wish of the historical mission, a time of the will of total domination in the region, and the participation of these countries have worsened considerably the situation. So a 40 years war, no, not because we have one single war, not because we have one single front, not because we have the same actors, but because throughout these 40 years you have many conflicts and wars, and at the end these conflicts and wars, they articulate between each other, and they create a huge Middle East from almost the Maghrebian countries to Afghanistan and Pakistan. A 40 years old war, and I think that this war brings us or make us to face the same question as the ancient Greeks during the War of Peloponnese and European societies, namely German society, during the 30-Year War. What is this question? The question of responsibility. And I think that it is absolutely essential to understand that the issue of responsibility has played a decisive role in the formation of the Greek philosophy. You cannot understand an author like Platon without taking into account the issue of the war and the destruction of the Greek societies, plural Greek societies, and the notion of responsibility. And you cannot understand the emergence of the international law, post-1648 international law, without taking into account the issue of responsibility. And today I think that the Middle Eastern societies face this question. How come that we have so many wars, so many violence, so many deaths? How come that we have the leaders like Bashar al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, Saddam Hussein, Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah Khamenei, Erdogan, etc., and that can act and destroy so easily? Who is responsible? What is the responsibility? What is the responsibility of the Middle Eastern societies and the citizens? I think that this kind of questions will be the decisive questions in the future of the Middle East, at least if we want to have a pacified Middle East. So I will stop here and making me available for your questions.
So, for me personally, it's always a great pleasure to listen to Professor Bozarslan. I have several questions, but I think maybe it's the opportunity for you if you have questions. No? Who wants to